Welcome to Module 1 of this structured series focused on coming back to oneself and understanding identity after emotional abuse. The series is presented as an educational piece, lectures if you will, designed for those who want a deeper, more objective understanding of narcissistic abuse. While the podcasts associated with this work often uses a storytelling format, this lecture series takes a different approach. It offers an academic framework for understanding patterns of behavior and psychological impact over time. This material is intended for individuals who have experienced narcissistic abuse in one form or another, as well as those seeking to understand it to support others more effectively. This series, titled Understanding Narcissistic Abuse, Identity, Conditioning, and Psychological Impact, begins with a foundational premise, and Module 1 focuses on how prolonged exposure to narcissistic abuse shapes identity through conditioning rather than reflecting personal defect or weakness. One of the most persistent misconceptions about narcissistic abuse is the belief that the harm the abuse causes reveals something fundamentally flawed in the individual who experienced it. And that happens because narcissistic abuse systematically redirects blame inward to the individual trapped in the grip of a narcissist. The person then convinces themselves that they're flawed. They often describe themselves as overly sensitive, insecure, dependent, indecisive, unable to trust their own judgment. So it's no surprise that many of these individuals believe they need to be fixed. And then so does everybody else. This lecture begins by challenging that assumption because the experiences commonly reported after narcissistic abuse are not indicators of personal deficiency. They are indicators of conditioning. Now, to understand why this misconception persists, it helps to look at narcissism in its academic context, not as a label, but as a pattern. In clinical psychology, narcissism is often discussed using the criteria outlined in the DSM-5-TR, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual used by mental health professionals. That manual describes narcissistic personality disorder as a pattern involving people who are overt or covertly grandiose. This framework is useful for clinical diagnosis, but it doesn't define the full scope of narcissistic harm. Most individuals harmed by narcissistic behavior, they weren't in a relationship with someone who had a formal diagnosis with NPD, narcissistic personality disorder. But our focus is not on diagnosis, but on recognizing behavioral patterns and understanding how repeated dynamics, such as reality undermining, erosion of self-trust, and emotional dependence, produce psychological harm over time. To understand how this reframing fits together, it's important to look at conditioning and how it operates. The central premise here is very straightforward. Loss of identity and narcissistic abuse is not the result of weakness. It's the result of adaptation. Human beings are highly adaptive. When placed in emotional, unsafe environments, they adjust in order to preserve connection, reduce conflict, and maintain psychological stability. And that adjustment is not a flaw. It's a survival function. Understanding this response as adaptive rather than defective allows us to examine the process by which it develops. Conditioning does not occur suddenly. It develops slowly, often in relationships that didn't begin as abusive. Early phases in the relationship may have included charm, intensity, emotional attunement, affirmation, and a sense of being uniquely understood. Then over time, these experiences become inconsistent. Periods of warmth are followed by withdrawal. Affection is followed by criticism. Connection is followed by confusion. This inconsistency, it's not random. It produces a state of emotional vigilance. One of the most powerful conditioning tools observed in narcissistic abuse is intermittent reinforcement. Intermittent reinforcement occurs when care, approval, or affection is delivered unpredictably. The individual is never certain which behaviors will be rewarded and which ones will be punished. The nervous system responds by increasing alertness and self-monitoring. Attention shifts away from internal needs and toward managing the emotional environment. This response is not obsession, it's adaptation under uncertainty. Intermittent reinforcement is often accompanied by a second, equally destabilizing process called reality distortion, and it may involve contradictory messaging in words, tone, and behavior that don't align, leaving the individual uncertain which cues to trust. Denial or reframing of prior events causing lived experiences to be minimized, dismissed, or reinterpreted after the fact. Shifting standards or exceptions where what is acceptable one moment becomes unacceptable the next, without any explanation. And over time, these patterns produce a specific psychological shift. Individuals begin to distrust their own perceptions and instead rely on the reactions of the other person to determine what is real. This is not a cognitive deficit. It's a learned response to repeated invalidation. Over time, invalidation does more than disrupt perception. It begins to alter self-understanding. Identity loss and narcissistic abuse is rarely abrupt. More often, individuals begin setting parts of themselves aside. Certain emotions are expressed less frequently. Certain opinions are withheld, and certain preferences are abandoned. It's not because they're forbidden, but because experience has taught which expressions lead to conflict or withdrawal. Over time, this self-silencing becomes automatic. When individuals later report, "I don't know who I am anymore," they are often describing a long process of adaptive suppression. Without an understanding of this process, the resulting behaviors are often interpreted as personal shortcomings rather than conditioned responses. That's why many post-abuse symptoms are just routinely misunderstood. This is often labeled as people-pleasing, indecision, emotional numbing, excessive self-doubt, and is more accurately understood as the aftermath of prolonged emotional restraint. These are not signs of being fragile. They are indicators of a nervous system that learned to prioritize safety overexpression. Before closing this topic, it's important to look briefly at what often remains afterward, whether during the relationship or after its end. Individuals frequently report feeling disoriented, ashamed, maybe disconnected from preference or values, uncertain about judgment and decision making. These experiences are often interpreted as permanent damage. However, conditioning does not eliminate identity, it obscures it. And what has been obscured can be recovered. Please keep in mind this first module is not focused on empowerment or action. Its purpose is clarification and relief. And the primary takeaway is this: if an individual feels disconnected from their sense of self, this doesn't indicate brokenness. It indicates that their psychological system adapted to an environment that required self-suppression in order to maintain stability. The next module will examine how this process unfolds gradually and why it often goes unnoticed until much later. For now, this framework provides a foundation. I'm Keil Hackley, attorney, author, and the host of the Are You Annie podcast. My work focuses on education, clarity, and identity recovery after emotional abuse. Thank you for staying with me, and stay tuned for Module 2. And I welcome your questions.